There comes a moment in life when silence becomes more powerful than any argument, when stillness speaks louder than defense, and when not reacting isn't weakness, but mastery. It's the quiet power of those who have stopped letting the world dictate their inner weather. You start to realize that the true measure of strength is not in how loud you roar, but in how calm you remain when everything tries to pull you into chaos. At first, this kind of peace feels foreign. The human mind is wired to react, to defend, to justify, to prove. Andrew Huberman might explain that your amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, lights up at every perceived threat. An insult, a rejection, a loss of control. The body surges with cortisol and adrenaline, preparing for battle. And so you fight, you send the text, you raise your voice, you demand to be understood. But after enough battles, you start to see the pattern. Every reaction drains your energy, while the problem remains. You win arguments, yet lose peace. You prove your point, yet stay empty. That's when you begin to suspect that maybe the real power was never in reacting, but in choosing when not to. Viktor Frankl once wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose. He learned this truth not in comfort, but in the horror of a concentration camp, where everything could be taken except one thing: the freedom to choose one's attitude. That space, small, invisible, but infinite, is where your soul grows. Reactivity collapses that space. Awareness expands it. When you stop reacting, you're not ignoring reality. You're mastering it. You're saying, I will not let external chaos define my internal state. Napoleon Hill would call this the law of control, the ability to govern your own mind regardless of conditions. He believed that the greatest human freedom was the power of thought, and that emotional control was the foundation of success. Hill taught that every person who achieves anything worthwhile has learned to pause between impulse and action, because in that pause lies direction. The reactive person lives like a leaf in the wind, blown by circumstance. The non-reactive one becomes the wind itself, guided by purpose, not provocation. Neville Goddard would interpret this even deeper. He'd tell you that every reaction is a seed planted in the imagination, and whatever you react to, you recreate. To react is to affirm something as real in your consciousness. When you meet insult with anger, you anchor that reality in yourself. When you meet it with silence and vision, you withdraw energy from the unwanted and feed the desired. Goddard's teaching was simple. You don't manifest what you wish, you manifest what you believe. And every reaction reveals belief. The one who refuses to react is not passive. They are consciously choosing a higher reality. Huberman might add that this act of non-reaction literally rewires your brain. Each time you pause instead of explode, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason and awareness, gains dominance over the limbic system. You strengthen neural pathways of calm, clarity, and control. Over time, what once triggered you deeply barely stirs you. The body learns peace as its baseline. You're no longer ruled by survival mode. You've upgraded to creation mode. But non-reactivity doesn't mean apathy. It's not about suppressing emotion or pretending you don't care. It's about feeling without feeding. You let emotion move through you, not dictate you. You recognize anger, fear, or hurt as visitors, not rulers. Frankl would say this is meaning in action, transforming suffering into growth. Because when you refuse to react, you transform the energy of pain into awareness. You become alchemist rather than victim. There's a quiet beauty in watching someone who's mastered this. You can see it in their eyes, steady, unbothered, present. You can feel it in their presence, anchored, not anxious. They don't need to prove their worth, because their calm is proof enough. They listen more than they speak, observe more than they judge. They understand that peace isn't found in winning arguments, but in no longer needing them. Imagine this. Someone insults you publicly. The old you would react instantly, fire back, defend, explain. But the awakened you simply smiles, maybe even nods, and moves on. You feel the surge of emotion, but you don't let it become action. You've learned that silence can burn brighter than fury. The other person feels it too, because nothing disarms chaos like calm. When you don't react, you deny the other person control over your state. You become untouchable. Napoleon Hill would call this self-mastery, the highest form of discipline. It's what separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. Because most people spend their lives reacting to news, to opinions, to emotions. They live in constant defense, mistaking movement for progress. But the one who's learned to pause, to wait, to observe, moves from intention, not impulse. They act when it serves purpose, not ego. Neville Goddard might tell you that this kind of restraint is creative magic. When you stop reacting to the old, you give space for the new to appear. Every time you refuse to affirm a negative reality with your attention, you're declaring, That's not my world anymore. Silence becomes your declaration of sovereignty. You start to notice how the world around you shifts. Conflict fades, peace deepens, synchronicities appear, because the outer world mirrors the calm of your inner one. Huberman would confirm this with science. The parasympathetic nervous system, the body's rest and repair mode, activates through calm breathing, long exhales, relaxed focus. By not reacting, you keep your system in that healing state. You recover faster, think clearer, and live longer. The body begins to trust that you won't throw it into war every time life throws a spark. That trust becomes your superpower. Your nervous system becomes your ally, not your enemy. Frankl would smile at that, because he knew that resilience is not built in comfort, but in choice. Every time you choose calm over chaos, you affirm the dignity of your own spirit. You prove that your peace cannot be purchased or provoked. It's yours by right of awareness. The world doesn't teach this kind of power. It celebrates loudness, outrage, quick comebacks, constant opinion. But look closely. Those most reactive are often the most exhausted. They live in permanent tension, always waiting for something to fight. The quiet ones, the still ones, the ones who let others talk while they observe. Those are the ones who move mountains in silence. There's a story about a monk who carried water daily up a hill. One day, a villager mocked him. "Why do you work so hard? What's the point?" The monk only smiled and kept walking. Years later, the same villager was still complaining about his life, while the monk had become serene, strong, and wise. That's the power of not reacting. It keeps you aligned with purpose while the world burns itself out in noise. Napoleon Hill would say that energy conserved by calmness is energy available for creation. Every reaction is an energy leak. Every restraint is an investment. The more you save, the more power you have to direct toward your vision. The people who accomplish great things aren't those who win every argument. They're the ones who no longer waste time having them. Neville Goddard would call that living in the end. When you no longer react to what contradicts your inner vision, you demonstrate faith. You're no longer arguing with appearances. You're aligned with the unseen reality you've chosen. You let the world catch up at its own pace. That's why the most powerful people rarely explain themselves. They don't fight for understanding. They embody truth. Huberman would translate that into neurochemistry. When you stay non-reactive, dopamine becomes your ally, not your addiction. You're no longer chasing quick emotional hits. You're building long-term reward circuits. Your motivation becomes stable. You start moving with focus instead of frenzy. You sleep better, think clearer, feel lighter. Calm becomes your natural state. Not something you chase, but something you are. Frankl would say this is freedom in its purest form. The ability to remain yourself under any circumstance. To not react doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care selectively. It means your energy has become sacred ground and not everyone gets access. It means you've learned to live by inner compass, not outer storms. And perhaps that's the quietest revolution of all. To live in a world that thrives on provocation and still choose peace. To be surrounded by noise and still choose silence. To face disrespect and still choose dignity. To witness chaos and still remain centered. Because the truth is, not reacting is not about being indifferent. It's about being undefeated. The quiet power of not reacting is the power of remembering who you are before the world told you how to feel. It's the wisdom of knowing that not every battle deserves your presence. Not every opinion requires your correction. Not every invitation to conflict needs your RSVP. You realize that your energy is your empire, and silence, your crown. So the next time someone tries to pull you into their storm, pause. Feel the emotion, breathe through it, and let it pass. Smile, even softly. Remember, they're reacting to their own pain, not your truth. And by not reacting, you stop the cycle right there. You break the chain of chaos. You remain the calm in the center of the storm. Frankl would call that meaning. Hill would call it mastery. Goddard would call it creation. Huberman would call it regulation. But beyond all definitions, it's peace. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that doesn't prove. The kind that doesn't depend on anything outside of you. Because once you taste that quiet power of not needing to react, of not letting the world pull your strings, you never go back. You stop dancing to chaos and start moving to rhythm. You stop surviving and start creating. You stop reacting and begin becoming.